Do you enjoy your alone time? Does being around lots of people drain your energy? Do others describe you as quiet? Well, you might just be an introvert. Let's have ourselves a pocket sized pep talk because today's guest knows quite a bit about this very topic.
A Pocket Sized Pep Talk, the podcast that can help energize your business and your life with a quick, inspiring message. Now, here's your host, Rob Jollis.
Today's guest, Jennifer Kahnweiler, PhD, is an author and global speaker who's called the champion of introverts. Her best-selling books, of which there are 4, have been translated into 17 languages. She's been featured in Forbes, Time Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. She's a fellow Barrett Kohler author and a friend of mine. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Oh, Rob, I'm so glad to be here.
Well, we see each other at author retreats when we used to have author retreats. So it's nice to be able to collaborate and have a conversation. I've always been curious because I'm kind of I'm the outlier on introverts. I'm a card carrying extrovert. But what I find interesting about you is you're an extrovert too. It's your husband who's the introvert. So I get that opposites attract, but kind of walk me through that.
So yes, Rob, you have nailed it. I talk oftentimes about my husband, Bill, and he's really the reason I got into this work. We've been married almost, believe it or not, 50 years. I can't believe it. And when I first married him, I didn't really understand the person who would kind of, after we were with people, would go in his cave. And, I'm laughing because we had a little apartment and he would go to one side of it actually, and I knew that I was more extrovert. I didn't have a name for it, but fortunately, shortly after we got together, I was introduced many years ago to the Myers-Briggs type indicator. A lot of probably the audience is familiar with. And I had that haha experience, and I came home and I remember telling Bill about it. And back then he was still listening to me. So we actually worked out our relationship a lot around that. It was interesting because I stopped having wondering and being resentful if he wasn't talking to me. I knew he needed to embrace silence and have his alone time. So he was my case study number 1. And then as I got into working in my field of counseling and then later into leadership development, HR, I worked in organizations. And because I had this lens to look through of introversion, I would be, very aware of my clients and the people I was coaching who were having a really hard time getting their ideas heard either in meetings or across the organization, trying to pitch things. Many of them were technical folks I worked with, particularly in the early years. And I realized that they were introverted, and that was part of the challenge working in more type A organizations.
Yeah. And, speaking from the extrovert camp, and just like Myers-Briggs, we're not all one thing or the other.
Exactly.
But I lean towards the extrovert, go figure.
Yes.
But what's always been interesting to me, and I have to watch it, I wrote an article about this, is that sometimes an extrovert, when I'm dealing with someone that I don't necessarily say, well, there's an introvert that just walked by. No, there's a person who's not really making eye contact with me and not really giving me the time of day. And I have to watch my instinct to say, well, maybe they're above me, or maybe they're just not fond of me. And I can feel sort of this, well, I'll show you. And then it's like, whoa, slow down. So talk to us extroverts a little bit and calm us down and remind us it's not personal.
No, it's not personal. And just to rewind for a moment so that we're all on kind of the level setting piece here, that introversion is really about the energy that you need and you get it internally. You get your energy from being in your head, from embracing silence. That's where the great thoughts appear. That's where you can go out into the world again and be energized with people. Many people, Rob, think that introverts don't like people, or they're like some of the phrases you were using there. And so they're challenged by a world that still has quite a bit of bias against that. And so, and extroverts get their energy from being out in the world and being stimulated, and again, they both like people, it's just how much. And so I think we had some good examples during pandemic of, how all of that came out. But to your point about, how you might make that initial judgment, it is bias, and it's not to criticize ourselves. We look for people kind of who are like us. And much of the time, this is really has more serious consequences. If you think about interviewing, for instance, and you have somebody who's an extroverted or somebody who's not aware of introversion, extroversion, and they don't have that, cognizance, when they're interviewing, they might even just do this subconsciously, is like think, they're not the kind of person I want to have a beer with, when really, and that can just completely discount that person who's interviewing, when it may not even have anything to do, as we know, with whether that person could do the job, So I think it's really important in those situations to be very clear about what it is you're looking for and to be more objective and to go over your own bias, and for instance, I advise my clients who are extroverted to pause, in all kinds of situations. We have a very hard time doing that because we're so excited and we get very energized. We don't realize we're cutting off people when we do that, because introverts need that to take a beat. Have you found that?
I actually think that now here's the sales side colliding. I think pausing is one of the most underrated communication moves there is.
Yes.
It demonstrates I'm listening. It demonstrates I'm processing what you say. And unfortunately, particularly in the sales world, and where we find a lot of extroverts, they're so busy working on their next question. They're so busy on what they want to say, or that they will just run through the stop sign, and it basically makes the other person feel like, did you hear anything that I just said to you?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, not just for a salesperson, when we're into a really meaty conversation and somebody's putting something deep out there, to take a pause, which, oh, by the way, is whatever you think in your head, whatever you're counting, double it. Because I can tell you my clock is very fast. So I'll go, all right, I'll take a pause. There, I took a pause. What do you want, another pause? You really have to almost count with your fingers to take a pause. And slow down.
That's so true. I'm glad you said that about the count your fingers. I once had a class a few years ago with, and there were a couple of extroverts in there, and it was a class on introverted leadership. And this woman raised her hand and she said, I've learned to literally count in my mind, 1, 2, 3. I have to do that every time. So I'm not always the first person who injects, because I do get enthusiastic and there's nothing wrong with that. But think about what we're missing. Right. In that meeting, for instance, if we don't, hear. But it's interesting to me you say about sales. I've always been very fascinated where the introversion and extroversion comes in, because, you probably know Dan Pink wrote this book, To Sell Is Human, and he used some of the research about ambiversion, that and really what it takes. And there, it's questionable about how much ambiversion is really a thing, but people sometimes identify with that, which is fine. Most of us, as you say, are not extreme introvert, extreme extrovert, but we have somewhat of a preference. But, he wrote about in that book many examples of the successful salesperson who uses both, uses the listening, but then has to get out there and be more the active, energetic one. So I wonder, do you see that as well?
I do it a lot. And it's something we have to almost physically slow people down on. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was training trainers for Xerox, and this is more in a group communication, but I would tell them, listen, when you ask a group a question, you have to pause. And I'd say, and so I challenged them. It was a 5-day program, and I kept a counter, a metal counter by my lectern. And I said, I'm going to show you that. I turned around. I said, every time I ask for a question, I'm counting to 10 with my fingers behind my back to slow me down. And my challenge is this: I'll bet over this next week, at least 10 times, you're going to hear somebody actually ask a question 5 seconds after I start pausing. And I mean, that takes a while to get to 5. And what happened? And of course, I always won the bet, because when you really do ask a question or you're having a conversation, it's authentic and real for somebody to lean back, kind of rub their chin and think about what you say. I don't have my next statement yet, unless I'm not listening to you, then I'm all ready to pounce on in. But Jennifer, I really agree with you. I think that pausing is one of the secret weapons.
Secret sauce.
Weapon's a bad word, but it's a secret of communication that most people do not understand. And I have to physically watch it myself.
Well, let me share with you a quick tip I learned. I know your listeners like practical tips. And this is something I came upon. I know I was very enthusiastic talking to this prospect. I was trying to sell something, and I was like, you're going to just mess up the deal if you keep talking. So I put my phone on mute. And, even if you don't have it on mute and you're just going, that's still almost getting in their way, I mean, even if you're saying anything. So let the person talk. And there was an awkward pause. And then they started telling me all of this information that was so critical to me putting that proposal together. I mean, I can think of many examples of that. And we, I think it's where we're focusing on this point a lot, but I can tell you from the introvert perspective that they've shared with me. You mentioned I'm a champion of introverts, and I really try to listen to what they're saying. I don't do it always as well at home. My husband will hold the book sometime and say, Jennifer, read the book.
I get the same thing with
right?
my
the
wife.
Same thing.
Mr. Communicator.
Well, you teach this stuff. But we let down our guard or something like that. But one of the things they talked about, this was a lot of pre-pandemic, because my last book I wrote was about the workplace, and we had a lot of open offices, and it was getting to a critical point of such frustration, not just for introverts, for everybody. And they were cramming more and more people. You remember that? If you can remember pre-COVID, in so many offices, it was just the overstimulation, the voices, do you have a minute? Can I stop by? And that was when I did a survey for that book, one of the top concerns and challenges and frustrations. It was like, I think over 85% of introverts said was interruptions.
Yeah. And
it's also with talking, with speaking. So interruptions in meetings, interruptions on phone calls. So I think, it's a good lesson to us extroverts. I don't want extroverts to think they have to just completely, be quiet and not say anything, because, what are some of the strengths of extroverts? There are a lot. We are great at facilitation. We're great at getting the energy pumped up. And including everybody in the room, on these virtual calls, I see my extroverted facilitators who I know really know how to engage people, so we're not saying you have to be completely quiet, but I think the more that we step over to the other side, this is true. We've been asking introverts to do that forever, right? You have to act like an extrovert. A lot of people say I'm an introverted extrovert. Well, they're really introverts, but they're pretending, they have to act as if. We have to go to the other side, but they also, it's like a two-sided thing. And the more that we do that we try on these skills, like you were saying about pausing, then we get better at it.
Yeah, agreed. I think this is where I kind of, a lot of times we beat up the sales forces a little bit. I'll tell you where I'll come to bat for them right now. Most salespeople, I refer to it as matching the pressure, like a handshake. How hard should I shake somebody's hand? The answer is as hard as it's coming into my hand.
Really?
That's how hard I shake it. Yeah. And
Good.
So what you find naturally with a lot of salespeople is they'll conform to the customer.
Yeah.
So if it's an analytical customer, they'll talk more in terms of numbers. If it's dominant, they'll talk more in terms of just general, this will get the job done. If they're social, they'll spend a little more time talking about the ball game that was on last night.
Right.
But if they're introverted, they'll back it down a little bit because they're trying to match the pressure, because that's the customer on the other side. It's the dinner table. It's the workplace. And I'm glad you kind of went into that, because I wanted to climb a little bit deeper in there.
Yeah.
It's when they're not selling that they'll do a lot more interrupting. They'll not match the pressure. So
that's so interesting. When they're not in their role of salesperson.
Exactly.
Yeah, but a lot of times we know that's when the sales happen, right?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Impressions you make at dinner, if you had one too many drinks, or you're just talking about sports to somebody who clearly isn't interested. Yeah. I've been in a lot of those dinners, so I speak from experience. But no, you're absolutely right. I think salespeople do that. But I've always been very interested, and I wanted to research this more. Most of the people, I don't see a predominance of introverts going into sales. Mm-hmm. I think, and maybe because there's a bias about the field in itself, but I think when you have really good listeners, when you have people that can learn and prepare, preparation is another tremendous strength. And one of the key 6 strengths that I found when I researched quiet strengths, it was preparation, it was listening, it was focused conversations, all of those things bubbled up. And you need that to be a great salesperson. So I'm always curious why that is the case, that the salespeople.
I think it's people, it's just the strengths of an extrovert is that they want to get in there into a conversation with somebody they've never met. But I will tell you this, working with big sales teams, most sales teams, it's not a coincidence that the salespeople work in pairs. These are
Yes.
the big ones, and they're called like wholesalers. You'll see an external wholesaler and an internal wholesaler.
Gotcha.
The
Okay.
external wholesaler is the one who's actually physically coming to the office, walking down, shaking hands, big,
Schmoozing.
yeah, the schmoozer. The
Yeah.
internal wholesaler may very well be the introvert who's basically backfilling. Now the introduction's been made. I need you to fill in, send these forms, process that, schedule this. Fine. And so they work in tandem. And I've seen good teams work that way, sort of like opposites attracting. I didn't really want to marry an extrovert, quite frankly. I'm the guy who gets on the coffee table and tells the story.
Two of us? Can you imagine two of us?
People should come to the retreat that we go to. There might be 50 people. It's basically Jennifer and me with the extroverts and 48 introverts.
That's why we get along so well. But one of the things you had mentioned, let me turn this, about genius opposites we were chatting about later. And your story reminds me of one that I profiled in that book where my friend Marty was on a team, only the way they worked it, they were totally opposite. Marty, my friend, is the super extrovert in healthcare sales, and his partner, I think his name was Brian, they had worked out, they were so successful, and they also took the best from each of them. Rob. And when they would have their big presentations up on the stage, Brian would go around and he would just kind of gauge the temperature. And he would have these very low key conversations with some of their prospects where Marty is up there, doing their whole thing. And then he did the follow up, like you said. So it's like, and that's one of the 5 areas that we found was very important for opposites to have even more extraordinary results than just, 1 + 1. It was exponential. When they could figure out, one of these things they did was cast the character, figure out who should we put in which role, but they give some thought to it. It's not happenstance. And part of that happens when you start working together. Right.
That makes sense. So now we're kind of climbing through this pandemic and we're working remotely. Is this a good thing for introverts or not a good thing for introverts?
Well, it depends when you asked. Like early on, it was people were in nirvana. I did a survey. I think I had like 200 introverts, and maybe like I think 199 were like, yes, bring it on. This is the best ever. And then I did another kind of touch base with a lot of those clients and my community of introverts. And, it was okay, but people were starting to get a little lonely year in. And I think that was true for everybody. They were missing even introverts, right? So now from what the research is that I've been following this really closely is that even introverts are liking the idea, depending on the role, of hybrid, because they are missing that connection. Like one of the things we found that works that makes a successful workplace and I called it an introvert-friendly workplace is collaboration, socialization, and focus, those 3 areas. And, you didn't really have much socialization. They were not about those like happy hours on Zoom. That just doesn't do it for them. But like just low key sort of connections, you didn't, it's hard to get that remotely. And also just catching up and understanding the context of what people are doing. I had 2 people I talked with yesterday in a company that I'm working with, and they, one of them is introvert, one's extrovert. The extrovert was calling from the office. The introvert was home. And I said, how do you feel about coming back? And the extrovert said, listen, we used to talk and I was learn. I don't know what so-and-so is doing now. We just have our regular formal meeting once a week, but I'm not hearing the backstory. I'm not hearing the concerns. And that doesn't happen on Zoom unless you really are intentional about it. And I find that face-to-face is, even introverts are saying that they would like some of it. And it also depends on the job that you have. Are you hearing any rumblings about the
a little? I'll tell you what I hear. I hear the term, of course, Zoom fatigue, that some people are just so tired of the Zoom. And the extrovert in me tells you, what do you want to go back to the Stone Age and pick up the phone? I'm still loving Zoom. I've been out 3 of the last 4 weeks conducting seminars live and loving that too.
Yeah,
but
you like both.
But I so enjoy seeing who I'm speaking to, and I can't believe that once upon a time I use that thing over there in the corner called a phone. It's when it rings, I'm almost angry at it. Like, well, what are you doing? You know, how, what,
You sound like an introvert there.
well,
I hate the phone.
Zoom me. I want to
Yeah.
see you because I can read people when I'm seeing them. I have trouble reading people when I'm listening to their voice. Not that we haven't tried, but
But you mean on Zoom, you're reading them as well?
oh yeah, I'm reading your
Yeah.
background. I'm reading how
Right.
you're dressed, your clothing. I'm
Yes.
reading when I say something, whether it's landing or it just changes in your facial expression. I get none of that. So where I can't necessarily, and I don't necessarily draw a line between introvert and extrovert. I keep
Mhm.
coming back to I need to know whether you're social or dominant, you know, in a sense,
Yes.
because I want to know how long I need to schmooze for. I'm a
Yeah.
schmoozer. Big deal. If
Yeah.
I remember I had a guy in Florida one time. His favorite question was, "Everybody has a story. I'd love to hear yours." And that's how you open up a sales call. But I would argue that terrific. You want to do that with a dominant customer? I don't want to tell you any stories. Get my
No.
story off the website. I've got 15 minutes. What do you have? And
Yeah.
so, how do we know whether to make that call? Well, visually, a lot of times I can just see it by the way you have your office set up.
Yeah.
There's more dominance. And I think perhaps, let me bounce it back to you. Can I read an introvert or an extrovert just visually by how they appear on screen?
Well, there's a question even before that. Do they appear on screen?
That's a really good question because you're right.
I have had to, I've had a lot of seminars, and I was launching this book during the pandemic, and we would do these fireside chats. We had a lot of people on screen, and we did trainings. And one of the things, at least, many introverts do not want to be on screen. It is Zoom fatigue, and there is science around that. I think it is really hard because one of the things we didn't mention, and this has occurred ever since I started writing about this in 2010. We didn't know much about this, Rob, but it's why do introverts get exhausted? It's not just, it's you're wired that way. That is true. Jung said that. He also said nobody is either a strict introvert or strict extrovert. We all have some of each, like you said. But stimulation, dopamine is something that's been studied, that extroverts need more of that chemical in the brain to get us going, right? Introverts get overwhelmed by too much dopamine. So if you know any introverts who are like my husband's, like if the lights are too bright or there's too much noise for too long, really loud noise or concert, and everyone's different. Not every introvert is like that. But they can go to a point and then they kind of really shut down. Whereas extroverts can take more of that, now relate that to Zoom. It's more intensity and energy from our brain to even be like what you're saying, figure the person out, look at the background. They can just listen. They prefer, that was even before the pandemic. They told me that. I said, I'd rather not see people. But so I would ask them in these trainings to do at least the beginning and the end to get on screen so we can at least see what you look like.
That's fun. I never connected the two, and it appears so obvious when you say that, because I'm always surprised when somebody says, yeah, okay, because I always go, all right, well, Zoom. I said, all right, I'll Zoom with you, but I'm not going to have my camera on. And I'm always thinking, well, for goodness sakes, why not? And I guess this is when introverts and extroverts are basically walking right into each other. Well, it's obvious for you and it's obvious for me. I love that. I've never thought about it. I thought it was, what, did you just not get dressed this morning? Why wouldn't you have your camera on?
That too. But it is a virtual world. We're all learning. Learning.
Right. All right. You write about something called loudership.
Oh, okay? Yeah.
What is that? I feel it's loud, but what is it?
I was doing interviews for I think it was the last book. Yeah. And I was talking a big pharma company and this name, I couldn't believe it. The name kept coming up, loudership. He says, oh, we joke about it, but it's the truth. That's the cultural norm. Edgar Schein talked about what leaders do and how they act. That's what people pick up in a culture. That's how they act. And that's how it was in this company, that they didn't talk about leadership. They said the loudest person in the room won. The loudest person in the room was, promoted. That was like the underlying, how every company has their own set of values and unspoken or spoken.
Right.
And so now I'm doing some work, very interesting work with Ed Frauenheim about quiet men. And this is coming up again. They what's the phrase they use? Large and in charge. They feel pressure to be that way because the companies they're in, whether it be in Silicon Valley or it be in a university, this is consistent that men who are quieter are feeling that intersectionality of those two things, of being male and also being quiet. But loudership is a thing. Anyway, I mean, it's not a real word, but I think we know what it means. And some companies, thankfully, are not like that, where the culture is one that doesn't push that theme. But it's very difficult, as I said earlier in our conversation, to get opportunities if you're in a situation like that, to grow and to develop. If you have that kind of stigma on you that you're not willing to get in there and be loud and be proud. And I did one company, this was my fault. I didn't do enough due diligence a few years ago. My friend invited me to speak to this group of, I don't want to name the company, but they were high-level tech folks in North Carolina. And I got in the room, it was some of their leaders, and the woman who's the woman in charge takes me aside and she says, so now you're going to tell everybody they need to really speak up and be loud extroverts, right? And we were talking to like 80% introverted leaders.
Right.
I was like, wait a second, I think we're on the wrong page here. But I mean, her requesting that really was saying it all. I mean, she didn't accept people that didn't express themselves in a more calm, more humble, quieter tone. That wasn't accepted in that culture.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you a very quick story that will make all introverts feel good. And of course, it's going to be a sales story because that's my stories. But I bet you never heard of the name Ben Feldman. But Ben Feldman sold life insurance, and Ben Feldman dominated the insurance industry. And when I say dominated, I mean 250,000, 250,000 salespeople, and he was number one. Number two sold 50 million of insurance. Number three sold 49 million, 48 million. Ben Feldman sold $152 million of insurance. So think about tripling number two in a pool of 250,000. So we all know what he looked like, right? And sounded like kind of an Alec Baldwin, Rob Jollis. How do you tell those two apart? And and just, a power keg of a man. I got to meet him. Ben Feldman stood about 5'3". He had hair like Larry on the Three Stooges. He spoke with a distinct pronounced lisp, and he was very quiet, sold from the sprawling metropolis of East Liverpool, Ohio. But I remember when I had lunch, they set up a lunch because I was a New York Life agent and I had sort of won this lunch. But I remember being shocked, stunned, couldn't believe that this was the mountain of and I was 21. What an amazing, I did this epiphany of, oh my goodness, their style and their technique, they're completely different. This person is not teaching me to be an introvert and extrovert. This person's very comfortable with who they are, but they're using very sound techniques to be successful in life, but they're not copying somebody else's style. And that's what Ben Feldman taught me at 21. And it's one of the greatest lessons I ever learned.
Oh my gosh. I love that story.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we need to share that with all introverts.
Yeah, the greatest salesperson who ever lived. And I always thought when I asked the question, I go, let's leave religion and politics out of it. In my mind, the greatest salesperson who ever lived, and I'm just going by numbers, was absolutely Ben Feldman. And oh, by the way, 16 years in a row, so consistency of over 1 million a month of sales, which many of us would end up with 2 or 3 million for the year. He strung that together for 16 years, so long, forever, not in Beverly Hills. Anyway, the champion, but not one attribute you associate with the stereotypical salesperson. So there you go. If we commit to who we are, Jennifer, right? Absolutely. That's what we got to do. We can't.
Be who we are. Who we are. And what I'm encouraged about as we go forward, and more people have this awareness. I have a Google alert for introverted leaders, and I got to tell you, there was crickets for several years. Once in a while, my article would pop up or blog or something, and now I get, 100 a week of, so it says to me, and with companies now having ERGs, employee resource groups for introverts, where they get support from each other and they educate the rest. I profiled some of those in creating introvert-friendly workplaces, where they actually give people tip sheets on what to say and not to say, like, how are you going to turn me off if you say what's wrong, like specific things to help all of us be able to communicate better. And so I'm really encouraged with this awareness. I call it introvert revolution, that it's affecting introverts and extroverts, and we can tap into both sides of ourselves. We can be more aware when we see somebody like you did, who's not kind of showing much on their face, we don't jump to the assumption that they're being unfriendly, which
this is not high school. You're not walking to algebra class and being dismissed by another human being.
Totally.
They're more nervous about making eye contact with you than you might imagine. But that's right. Again, my gut instinct was, I'm back in high school. You won't even look at me. Well, I'm not looking at you. Now we're even.
Yeah, but then see, you're aware of that, and then you could stop yourself and say, "Wait, Rob Giles, is that that's something I don't need to keep."
Right, this is not personal. Right.
I can get rid of that, So I hope that with that individual knowledge, with our teams, that when we see people that are maybe a little different than us, introvert, and again, judgment on both sides. Right. Introverts can be very critical of extrovert. I mean, really. So, but I think what we start to do individually, teams. And then where I'm really hoping this goes more is organizations, that it becomes just the way we've dealt with gender, and we're dealing with race in many ways. And it just becomes part of the conversation. Right. So, the really good leaders are amplifying this discussion.
Yeah, I've got 20 more questions for you, but I've got to begin to wrap up. But let me, I got to ask this one question though. My wife, Ronnie, an introvert, worked at a school for 10 years, and they had meetings. She was a teacher. She told me when I met her that in 10 years, she'd never spoken once in the meeting. And I said, well, there are 300 people in this meeting. How many people in the meeting? 9, 10. So, I gave her a hug, and I thought, I want to meet who's managing this meeting. I want to meet the person who's running this meeting, who's left behind the introvert. Yeah. So how can we make sure that introverts aren't left behind at these meetings and at these tables, because their instinct will not be on their own to jump in. So I hear.
And I hold the principal, whoever the leading the meeting, responsible for that. Right. Ronnie to some extent, but really more the leader. So what can the leader do? They can play to the introvert strengths. They can know that an agenda is important to have for a meeting, even if it's a short agenda. Introverts, as I mentioned, like to prepare. And so if they know what's coming up, they will tell you to a fault. If I know what we're going to be addressing, I can think about it. I can think about what my contribution is. And that's really helpful. Okay. If you have things you want me to look at ahead of time, this is good, what they call meeting hygiene. I learned that when I was out in Silicon Valley doing this research. I kept saying meeting hygiene. It's like, what? But no, it's true. It's like what we know about how do you run a good meeting. You have an agenda, you prepare them, but you send it to people not the second before. You give them a little time to think about the proposal. And then when you get in the meeting, you make sure you have some practices in place that, and if you got to read a meeting book or, or take a meeting course, there's it's all proven about how you can engage people. And now on Zoom, there's lots of ways to chat. Introverts like to do that. Make sure you hear from everybody in the room. Go around, do a structured thing. Let's just hear where you are on this, red light, green light, why, have some little techniques that you can bring in so people don't feel threatened.
Yeah. Obscure, but I used to teach running meetings for Xerox and some other things. And Xerox had one of the most interesting things that I'd never heard before or after. We obviously had a leader in every meeting. We had a timekeeper in every meeting. We had a scribe in every meeting, but we also had somebody called a process guide in every meeting. And that the leader's job was to lead. Actually, don't worry about the introverts or the extroverts. Get the job done. Okay. Yeah. However, the process guide is sitting on your hip. She or he, their job was to make sure that one person wasn't dominating the conversation, or one person wasn't being left behind, or one person wasn't cut off, or when we disagreed professionally, and
Yes.
we didn't saddle the leader with that. We gave a particular person a process guide, and that's how we accomplished it. And Jennifer, I can tell you that it was usually the people who were the quieter ones who had taken in 2 or 3 meetings very quietly, who, when you asked them and made it and gave them an entry, had a perspective and an angle that nobody had, because they've been listening.
Because they've been listening. They call the analogy I heard by one of my participants one time. I love this. She goes, there's a cackling geese that are there, and those are the extra. Because oftentimes they're talking, they have an opinion about everything, and then you got the great blue heron, who slowly, beautifully swoons into the river and gets the fish, and what they say nails it, because they've been observing and listening. And I love that image, but I love the idea of a process person.
Yeah, process guide is what they were called, and we rotated roles. So everybody got a team, but we actually learned even the timekeeper, we got 4 things to accomplish. We're going to spend 10 minutes on each thing. Well, it's 12 minutes. We're still on the first one, and the timekeeper isn't paying attention. That's okay. The process guide is, but that's for another conversation.
No, I love that, Ron and Robin. And it's so interesting. So many people don't follow that, and it's unfortunate. But there are many other techniques that I have in my books about how, on both sides of the equation, as a leader, you can encourage and involve your team, because if you don't, you're really missing out on could be at least 40 to 60% of your contributions.
Right.
And also for the individual, things that you can do to step up and be heard, and do it in a way that's not scary like it was for Ronnie.
Right. All right. So we got quiet influence, the introverted leader, the genius of opposites. Which one am I missing?
You're missing the latest one, I think. Creating. It's
there it is.
Creating introvert-friendly workplace.
But we got an Amazon authors page.
Shameless self-promotion.
That's all right. We got an Amazon authors page, right? So all we got to do is find you, and we've got them all, right?
Find my name, and I actually have everything on my website, and I have downloadable free chapters, excerpts, quizzes, a quiz for each book. That's free, that's short, are you an introvert, extrovert, all those things, how you're doing with your partner. So all kinds of good stuff on my website.
That was my last question. So you're hitting that one right now. How do people get a hold of you? What's the website?
So it's my website, jenniferconweiler.com, as long as you can spell my name.
Yeah, well, they're not going to. So spell your name.
Oh, yeah, they're not going to. Okay.
Yes.
It's Jennifer, Jennifer, Conweiler, KAHNWEILER.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm very active on there.
Good. So, and I'll have it on our landing page here. But that's jenniferconweiler.com. You can find her books on Amazon, translated into 17 languages. I'm at 12 languages, so I'm not even talking to you. How dare you? How dare you come on my show?
What about our friend Devorah? She's got a bunch too, right?
Yeah. Any case, Jennifer, been a delight. Really enjoyed chatting with you. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Rob. It was my pleasure. Really fun.
Well, we'll do it again as well as we can next time, folks. Until then, stay safe.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please rate and recommend it on iTunes, Outcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information on this show and Rob at jollis.com.